Why was the helicopter shaking before it even left the ground? At 400 feet, the warning alarms would scream. At 400 feet, a man would start to die. But that hadn't happened yet. Savannah woke slowly that morning, the way it always did, Spanish moss swaying over Bull Street, container ships gliding up the river like metal whales in gray water. The air was heavy, humid, patient. Kaya Nolani bird song was already at the coastal air medical hangar before sunrise. She sat alone on a tarmac bench, hands wrapped around black coffee, staring at the EC-145 as if it might disappear if she blinked. She wore her flight suit like armor. Her braid was tight, her expression tighter. She had been grounded for 16 days. Not officially, of course. The paperwork said temporary reassignment. The reality felt like exile. Victoria Stanhope from Patriot Shield Insurance had arrived with spreadsheets and a smile sharp enough to cut flight hours in half. Kaya's transports were unnecessary expenditures, her judgment aggressive, her instincts unverified. She'd been moved to the ER. Every time a helicopter lifted off, the ceiling tiles trembled. Kaya would look up mid-IV, mid-sentence, mid-breath. Ignored. That was the word she never said aloud. Ignored by an algorithm, ignored by administrators, ignored by the sky. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. Not about the hearing aids hidden under her headset. Not about the titanium plates in her skull. Not about the 340 combat missions logged under a name they would recognize instantly, if she let them. She asked rookie questions during pre-flight, pretended not to understand rotor torque curves, let Captain Travis, Rooster, Coburn explain basics she had mastered a decade ago. She hid because the last time the Army discovered her weakness, they took her wings. In 2018, an RPG had turned an MH-60M Blackhawk into falling fire over Syria. Her co-pilot had died. She had survived. Survived but not unchanged. The medical board called it non-qualifying hearing loss. She called it guilt. So she worked quietly, saved lives from the back of helicopters, never touched the controls. Until Fort Stewart called. The overhead speaker in the ER crackled. Mass casualty incident. Live fire training accident. Multiple critical. Rooster was airborne on another run. The second EC-145 sat fueled and useless on the pad. No pilot. A Navy SEAL was bleeding out. Kaya felt something inside her narrow to a single, ruthless equation. Helicopter. Patient. No one else. She pulled off her gloves. "I can fly it," she said. The ER went silent. Dr. Ansari blinked. "You're a nurse." "I'm a Chief Warrant Officer 3, she replied evenly. 160th SOAR, 340 combat missions. I have the aircraft. She didn't wait for permission. She ran. Across asphalt, across doubt, across 6 years of self-punishment. In her flight bag were worn leather gloves that didn't quite fit, Danny Clearwater's gloves, her crew chief, the man who died beside her. She put them on. Her hand stopped shaking the moment the battery switch flipped. The engine whine rose through the frequencies, and something inside her woke up. At 800 feet, crosswinds hit hard over coastal Georgia marshland, 35 knots gusting. Behind her, paramedic Zeke Okafor stared at the back of her helmet in stunned silence. "Those gloves," he said softly. "They belong to my crew chief," she replied. "He died in my aircraft." She didn't say, "I think it was my fault." She didn't need to. Smoke rose over Fort Stewart as they approached. The landing zone was chaos, dust, vehicles too close, soldiers running in panic. She executed a steep, controlled descent that made an Army crew chief on the ground mutter, "That's not civilian." Master Chief Thomas Vukovich lay on a stretcher, femur shattered, femoral artery compromised. 22 years of service, minutes left to live. Kaya packed the wound in 11 seconds. Combat style. Load him, she ordered, 90 seconds. They lifted off. At 400 feet, the amber hydraulic caution light blinked alive. There it was. The choice. Protocol said land immediately. Math said keep flying. Behind her, Vukovic's blood pressure dropped. 6 minutes of air would save him. 12 minutes of ground would kill him. Math doesn't care about policy. She kept flying. The controls grew heavier, resistance creeping into the cyclic. She hummed under her breath, Aloha, oh, the lullaby her mother once sang, the same melody she had hummed in a burning Blackhawk 10 years earlier while talking wounded operators through tourniquets over the radio. Behind her, through shock and blood loss, Vukovic's eyes flickered open. Nightingale, he whispered. Her hands froze for half a heartbeat. No one had called her that in 6 years. Not since Helmand Province. Not since the night she flew 47 miles in hostile airspace with a dead co-pilot and 3 dying men. She swallowed. Kept flying. They crossed the Savannah River low and fast, metal cargo ships sliding beneath them. On the rooftop helipad at Coastal Memorial, a crowd gathered. Nurses, doctors, security. And Victoria Stanhope, leather portfolio pressed against her chest, watching the rookie nurse land like a combat aviator. The touchdown was flawless. Vukovic made it to surgery in 4 minutes. He lived. 3 days later, he asked to see the nurse who flew him in. When Kaya stepped into his ICU room, hearing aids visible, gloves in hand, he pulled back his sleeve. A tattoo, a nightingale perched over a Blackhawk silhouette, dated October 14, 2014. Every man on that mission carries this, he said, voice thick. We never knew your name, we called you Nightingale. Her throat closed. He handed her a challenge coin worn smooth by a decade of searching. You sang us home, he said. Word spread faster than any official channel. Within hours, the hallway outside his room filled with uniforms, Army aviators from Hunter Army Airfield, SEALs from Virginia Beach, retired night stalkers who had once served in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. They stood at attention as she stepped into the corridor. 30 hands rose in salute. Rooster's arm shook as he held his. Kaya raised Danny's gloves to her temple and returned it. Proud. Not loud, not triumphant. Just steady. The investigation that followed unraveled Patriot Shield's algorithm, denied transports, veteran claims flagged as high cost, lives reduced to margins. Victoria Stanhope resigned quietly. Colleen Marsh retired even more quietly. But the real change was smaller, softer. Kaya stopped hiding her hearing aids. She applied for civilian pilot certification with accommodation. She started teaching what she called the Nightingale Protocol, combat-tested aeromedical techniques adapted for civilian crews. Tommy Vukovic attended the first-class graduation in dress blues. Months later at sunrise, Kaya climbed into the left seat of the EC-145, this time officially as pilot. 4. The Savannah River shimmered gold below. Spanish moss caught morning light. She lifted smoothly into the air. Not to prove anything. Not to reclaim glory. Just because someone, somewhere would need her. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. Sometimes it doesn't argue with algorithms or beg for permission. It waits. And when the moment comes, when there's a helicopter on the pad and a life on the line, it simply acts. How do you live with the sound of something breaking that no one else can hear? 6 years earlier, the sky over Helmand Province had been black and endless. Not peaceful black, not the kind that carries stars. The kind that swallows them. Kaya sat in the right seat of the MH-60M Blackhawk, visor down, night vision painting the desert in sickly green. The radio chatter was calm, too calm, the kind that always made her skin tighten. 3 operators in the back, 1 SEAL embedded for joint coordination, extraction hot, expected small arms, nothing unusual. Nothing ever felt unusual until it did. The first RPG didn't hit. The second did. It came in from their 7 o'clock low, a streak she only saw because the crew chief, Danny Clearwater, shouted a warning half a second before impact. The explosion wasn't loud at first. It was pressure, a violent shove, then light, then alarms. Hydraulic failure warning, master caution, the smell of burning composite and aviation fuel flooding the cockpit. Her co-pilot slumped forward before she understood what had happened. A piece of shrapnel had torn through the canopy, through him. She didn't scream. Training erased that option. Controls, she said automatically. No answer. Controls louder. Still nothing. The aircraft rolled left. Danny's voice cut through the chaos. You have it, Nightingale. She grabbed the cyclic. The Blackhawk fought her, controls sluggish, hydraulics bleeding out, warning tones layering over one another until the cockpit sounded like it was panicking for her. In the back, someone was shouting, someone else was praying. The SEAL was bleeding from the shoulder. Another operator was unconscious. There were 47 miles of hostile territory between them and the nearest forward operating base. 47 miles. And she was suddenly alone in the cockpit. This is where people break, she would later think. This is where you either fracture or you become very, very still. She became still. Listen to me, she said over the intercom, voice steady in a way that surprised even her. We are flying home. She began issuing instructions, tourniquet placement, wound packing, pressure points. Between callouts, she adjusted trim manually, compensated for drag, managed torque carefully to avoid overstressing what little hydraulic assist remained. The aircraft trembled like it wanted to fall apart in her hands. She started humming. Not because she was brave. Because she was terrified. Aloha O. The melody threaded through rotor noise and pain, and the metallic taste of fear. She didn't think about dying. She thought about distance. 47 miles. 46. 45. She landed hard at the fob, skids striking dirt with a jolt that rattled her teeth. The operators survived. Her co-pilot did not. Danny died 3 hours later from internal injuries. The official report said enemy fire. Her heart said something else. You should have seen it sooner. You should have reacted faster. You should have. Guilt doesn't need evidence. It only needs silence. The medical board evaluation, months later, felt colder than any desert night. You have measurable hearing degradation, the colonel said without looking at her. Permanent. I can compensate. Regulations are regulations. She sat there in uniform, hands steady on her knees, while someone reduced 14 years of flying to a line item. She had survived combat. She had not survived bureaucracy. They grounded her. Not because she lacked skill, because she lacked perfection. And perfection in aviation is mandatory. She didn't argue. Arguing would mean admitting how much it hurt. Instead, she left. Walter Reed, surgery, titanium plates in her skull, hearing aids fitted discreetly. Then Savannah. Then Coastal Air Medical. Then hiding. She asked rookie questions because if they believed she was inexperienced, they wouldn't look too closely at why she flinched at certain frequencies. She let Rooster teach her things she could teach in her sleep. She let them think she was smaller than she was. It felt safer. Until Fort Stewart. 3 days after the hydraulic light flight, Kaya couldn't sleep. The adrenaline had long since burned off, leaving something heavier behind. Exposure. Rooster knew. Zeke knew. The hospital board knew. The army definitely knew. Her phone had not stopped vibrating. Unknown numbers, old contacts, a retired colonel whose name she hadn't seen in 6 years. She ignored them all. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment above the bookstore on Broughton Street, Danny's gloves resting in her lap. They still smelled faintly like aviation fuel. She pressed her thumb into the worn crease along the knuckle. "I flew again," she whispered into the empty room. The words felt fragile. She half expected them to shatter. Her grandmother called at 7, as always. "Are you flying?" Bertie asked. Kaya hesitated. "Yes." Silence on the line. Not surprise. Not shock. Just understanding. "The bird remembers," Bertie said softly, "even when she pretends she doesn't." Kaya closed her eyes. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Of crashing." No, of wanting it too much. Desire had cost her before. Desire to push the envelope. Desire to complete the mission. Desire to believe she could handle anything. Bertie's voice was steady as mountain stone. "Wanting the sky does not cause the storm. It only reminds you who you are." Kaya exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, the guilt felt less like a verdict and more like a scar. Still there, but not bleeding. Back at Coastal Memorial, the atmosphere had shifted. Staff who once saw her as quiet now watched her with something like awe. She hated that. Awe builds pedestals. Pedestals create distance. She didn't want distance. She wanted normal. Zeke found her in the hangar the next morning, running her hand along the EC-145's fuselage. "You could have told me," he said gently. "I know. Why didn't you?" She considered the real answer. "Because if you knew what I used to be, you'd expect me to still be that." Instead, she said, "because I didn't know if I still was." Zeke studied her face for a long moment. "You didn't hesitate up there." "Yes, I did." When he said Nightingale. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. It felt like being dragged backward through time. "You kept flying." She nodded. "That's the job." But it wasn't that simple. Keeping the aircraft steady had been easier than steadying her heart. Hearing that call sign had cracked something open. She had spent 6 years burying it. Now it refused to stay buried. Tommy Vukovic asked to see her again before he was discharged. He was sitting upright this time, color back in his face, leg braced but intact. "You ever think about coming back?" he asked casually. "To the teams," she replied with a faint smile. "To flying." "I am flying." "You know what I mean." She did. The Army had already reached out. Waivers under review. Policy updates for experienced aviators with corrected hearing loss. Doors that had been welded shut were quietly unlocking. "I don't know," she admitted. Tommy nodded. "Fair." He leaned back slightly. "You saved us 10 years ago," he said. "All of us. But here's the part nobody told you." She raised an eyebrow. "After that mission, every man on that bird re-enlisted." She blinked. "What?" "Every single one. Because if someone like you could fly through that and still sing, we figured we could keep going too." The weight of that settled slowly. She had always believed that night was defined by what she lost, not by what others gained. Tommy continued, "You don't get to decide what your survival means to other people." That unsettled her. She liked control. Control was safe. This felt vulnerable. He smiled faintly. Whatever you choose next, just don't choose it out of fear. But that night, Kaya stood on the rooftop helipad alone. Savannah stretched around her in soft gold light. The river glimmered. The air smelled like salt and heat. She closed her eyes and listened. Rotor wash from a departing aircraft vibrated through concrete. Her hearing aids caught the frequencies imperfectly. Not pristine, not flawless, but enough. She thought about the medical board, about the moment they said non-qualifying, about how small she felt walking out of that office. Then she thought about Fort Stewart, about hydraulic warnings in math, about a dying man whispering her call sign. She realized something uncomfortable. They hadn't taken her wings. She had, out of shame, out of fear that she wasn't whole enough to deserve them. The sky had never rejected her. She rejected herself. The wind tugged at her braid. She opened her eyes. Below, the EC-145 waited quietly on the pad. She didn't climb in. Not yet. But she didn't turn away either. For the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to want it without apology. And that, more than any salute or headline, felt like the real beginning. What happens when the world decides you're a symbol, but you're still just a person trying to breathe? The hallway salute followed Kaya everywhere. Not literally, but in the way people looked at her now. Coastal Memorial had changed its tone overnight. Nurses who once chatted casually now straightened when she entered a room. Residents whispered. A few even asked for selfies. She hated that. Symbols don't get to be tired. Symbols don't get to hesitate. Symbols don't get to doubt. And she was very, very tired. 3 weeks after the Fort Stewart flight, the official Army inquiry concluded what everyone already suspected. Patriot Shield's transport denial algorithm had cost lives. The Georgia Insurance Commissioner's office opened a formal investigation. Veterans, groups began calling. News trucks parked outside the hospital for 2 straight days. The words "Nightingale nurse" appeared on local headlines. She stopped watching the news. Rooster found her in the hangar one afternoon, sleeves rolled, grease on her fingers as she helped a mechanic check a rotor housing. "You're scrubbing parts now?" he asked, leaning against the landing skid. "It's honest work," she replied without looking up. He studied her quietly. "You okay?" She tightened a bolt just a little too hard. "I don't want to be famous for doing my job." Rooster nodded slowly. "Good. Good. If you liked it, I'd worry." She paused, then exhaled. "What if I mess up next time?" she asked softly. "What if the next flight isn't perfect?" Rooster stepped closer, voice lower now. "Kid, you think I've never messed up?" She glanced at him. "I've had landings that make you pray," he continued. "I've had nights I replayed in my head for years. The difference between good pilots and bad ones isn't perfection." "What is it?" "They keep getting back in." That word again. Back. As if returning were simple. As if it didn't require walking straight through the thing that broke you. The Army letter arrived on a Tuesday. Cream envelope, official seal. Inside, a personal note from the current commander of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Policy updates under review. Waivers for experienced aviators with correctable hearing loss being expedited. An invitation, not an order, to consider reinstatement. She read it 3 times. Her hands didn't shake. That scared her more than if they had. She drove that weekend to the Smoky Mountains, to the Qualla boundary in North Carolina, where her grandmother still lived. The road wound through hills thick with late summer green. The air grew cooler as elevation climbed. She stopped first at the cemetery outside Cherokee. Danny Clearwater's headstone was simple: rank, name, dates. She knelt in the grass. "I got the letter," she said quietly. Wind moved through the trees. "I don't know if going back means I'm brave or just unfinished." She rested Danny's gloves on the stone. "I flew again," she added. "You'd have liked the landing." For a moment, she allowed herself to feel pride without flinching. Then she stood and drove to her grandmother's house. Birdie Birdsong was on the porch, weaving a basket from white oak splints. Her hands moved slow and certain. "You are carrying a question," Birdie said before Kaya even spoke. Kaya smiled faintly. "It's that obvious." Birdie's eyes softened. "To me." They sat together in silence for a while. Finally, Kaya handed her the letter. Birdie read it carefully, lips moving slightly with each word. "They want you back in the sky," she said. "Yes." "And do you want to go?" Kaya stared out at the mountains. "I don't know if I miss the flying, or the version of me who existed when I was flying." Birdie nodded thoughtfully. "Those are not the same thing." Kaya swallowed. "If I go back and something happens again, I don't know if I could survive losing another crew." Birdie set the letter aside and took Kaya's hands. "You survived the first loss," she said gently, "but you have been punishing yourself for living." Kaya's jaw tightened. "That is not honor," Birdie continued. "That is fear dressed as loyalty." The words landed hard. "You were not given life so you could shrink it," her grandmother said. "You were given life so you could use it." They sat with that. No pressure, no command. Just truth. Back in Savannah, Kaya returned to coastal air with clearer eyes. The board had officially reinstated her as dual role: flight nurse and pilot under civilian certification, pending final paperwork. Her hearing aids were no longer hidden. The first time she stepped into the cockpit with them visible, a young paramedic hesitated. "Does that affect anything?" he asked carefully. "Yes," she replied calmly. "It makes me better at asking for what I need." He blinked, then nodded. That small exchange felt larger than any salute. The next major call came at dusk. Multi-vehicle collision on I-95, 3 critical, 1 pediatric. The words pediatric trauma tightened something in her chest. Children are different. They don't understand fear the same way adults do. They trust blindly, which makes failure heavier. She climbed into the left seat. Rooster watched from the edge of the tarmac, arms crossed. "You good?" he asked. She met his gaze. "Yeah." It wasn't bravado. It was acceptance. The flight out was smooth. The sky streaked purple and gold over coastal Georgia. On scene, the smallest patient, a 7-year-old girl, was unconscious with internal bleeding suspected. Kaya knelt beside her. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, though the child couldn't respond. "We're going for a ride." In the air, turbulence picked up unexpectedly. The EC-145 jolted. The paramedic glanced toward the cockpit. Kaya's hands were steady. Inside, though, a flicker of old memory rose. Hydraulic lights, burning fuel, Danny's voice. She inhaled, then exhaled slowly. "This is now. Not then." She adjusted trim, compensated for wind shear, kept her tone level as she coordinated with trauma receiving. Behind her, the little girl's vitals stabilized. They landed without incident. As the child was wheeled into surgery, Kaya remained seated in the cockpit for a moment longer than usual. Her heart was pounding. Not from fear. From relief. She had felt the memory surge. And she had not frozen. Progress isn't loud. Sometimes it's just choosing not to flinch. That night, alone in her apartment, she placed Danny's gloves back in their box. Not as relics, not as anchors, as history. She picked up the army letter one more time. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not a rejection, not an acceptance. A pause, because she realized something important. The sky was no longer the only place she could serve. At Coastal Air, she could train civilian crews in advanced hemorrhage control, in high-risk approaches, in staying calm when alarms scream. She could build something lasting, not just fly through it. The next morning, she gathered the flight nurses in a small conference room. "I want to start a new training module," she said simply. "What kind?" Zeke asked. "The kind that prepares you for the flight you hope never comes." They leaned in. She began outlining combat-tested aeromedical techniques adapted for civilian practice: crew resource management under duress, decision-making under system failure. She didn't mention Helmand. She didn't mention the Black Hawk. She just taught. Because sometimes redemption isn't about returning to who you were. It's about using what you survived to make others stronger. Later that afternoon, as she lifted off for a routine cardiac transfer, Savannah stretched beneath her in warm sunlight. The river glimmered. Spanish moss swayed. Her hearing aids caught the engine's hum imperfectly, but clearly enough. She didn't feel like a symbol. She didn't feel like a legend. She felt present. And for the first time in years, that was enough. What if the next emergency wasn't about skill, but about trust? 2 months after Fort Stewart, the calls had settled into rhythm again. Not normal. Normal would imply nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Kaya now signed the manifest as pilot in command at least twice a week. The first time she saw her name printed in that column, something inside her went quiet. Not loud pride, not triumph. Alignment. But trust is fragile in aviation. It's built in checklists and reinforced in calm landings. And sometimes it's tested when no one expects it. The storm rolled in faster than forecast. Late September along the Georgia coast can turn violent without warning. The Atlantic gathers heat all summer, then exhales it all at once. That afternoon, dispatch sent them north, single-vehicle rollover on a rural stretch of highway outside Hinesville. Suspected spinal trauma, rapid deterioration. Routine. Until the sky darkened mid-flight. At 1,200 feet, rain began to hammer the windshield in sheets so thick the world blurred into gray. Zeke leaned forward from the medic seat. "Weather updated, cell moving east at 25 knots. We can divert." Kaya scanned instruments, cross-referenced radar. They had a narrow corridor, 6 minutes before the system swallowed their route entirely. 6 minutes. The number echoed faintly. Math again. "How's the patient?" she asked over intercom. "BP dropping. EMS says he's losing responsiveness." 6 minutes could mean paralysis. Or life. She adjusted heading. "We thread it," she said calmly. Zeke didn't argue. That was trust. They hit turbulence hard at 1,500 feet. The EC-145 shuddered, rain distorting horizon lines. Her hearing aids amplified some frequencies and softened others. In heavy weather, that could disorient lesser pilots. But she had learned something in Helmand skis years ago. When visibility lies, trust your instruments. When fear lies, trust your training. She flew on gauges. Steady hands. Measured inputs. No drama. They broke through the worst of it with 2 minutes to spare. On the ground, the accident scene was chaos. Flashing lights reflecting off slick pavement. Firefighters bracing against wind. The patient was younger than expected. 19. College football recruit, broken C-spine suspected. As they lifted off, lightning split the horizon. For a brief second, the sky illuminated white. And she saw it. A memory superimposed over reality. Burning debris falling in darkness. Danny's last shout. Her grip tightened involuntarily. The helicopter dipped a fraction. Tiny. Barely noticeable. But she felt it. The old tremor trying to surface. Zeke's voice was cautious. "I'm good," she replied. But inside something was shaking. Not the aircraft. Sir, trauma doesn't disappear because you succeed. It waits for conditions. Storms are good conditions. She forced her breathing slower. 4 counts in. 4 counts out. This is now. Not then. She corrected the slight drift and stabilized. Behind her, the 19-year-old's mother's voice crackled over EMS radio, replayed by dispatch. "Please don't let him die." Kaya swallowed. This wasn't about proving she could handle storms. It was about not letting old ghosts steal new lives. They landed at Coastal Memorial, with wind still gusting over 20 knots. The trauma team rushed the young man inside. Spinal surgery began within minutes. He would walk again. But when the rotors wound down and silence filled the cockpit, Kaya didn't move. Her hands remained on the controls long after shutdown. Rooster climbed up onto the skid, peering in. "You froze for half a second up there," he said gently. Not accusation. Observation. She nodded. "Lightning," she admitted. He leaned against the doorframe. "Half a second is human." She stared ahead. "I can't afford human." Rooster's jaw tightened. "That's where you're wrong." Silence stretched. "You think the guys in that hallway saluted you because you're invincible," he continued. "They saluted you because you kept going while scared." She exhaled slowly. "I felt it coming back," she confessed. "The night over Helmand, the drop in the controls. For a second I wasn't here. But you came back. That mattered. More than perfect control. More than flawless approach angles. Coming back." That evening she didn't go home. Instead, she drove to the quiet edge of town near the marshes, where the sky opens wide and uninterrupted. She sat on the hood of her truck, watching storm clouds move out toward the Atlantic. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Almost. "Chief Birdsong," the voice asked when she answered. It took her a second to recognize it. Colonel Harris, former commander, within the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. "Yes, sir. I heard about the Fort Stewart flight," he said simply, "and the storm today." She stiffened slightly. "How?" "We still pay attention." A faint smile touched her lips. "Yes, sir." A pause. "We're finalizing the waiver process," he continued. "If you want back in, the door is open." There it was. The decision she'd been circling for weeks. The marsh wind brushed her face. "I appreciate that," she said slowly, "but I'm building something here." Silence on the other end. "Understood," he replied. "Just know this, your service didn't end because paperwork said so." After they hung up, she remained sitting there, absorbing the weight of choice. For the first time, declining didn't feel like surrender. It felt deliberate. The Nightingale Protocol classes had grown from a handful of nurses to 2 full cohorts. She stood before them now in a modest conference room, projector humming softly. No dramatic storytelling. No war stories. Just structured lessons. System failure isn't the moment to discover your limits, she told them. It's the moment to rely on preparation. A young nurse raised her hand. Were you ever scared flying? Kaya didn't dodge it. Yes. The room grew still. Every pilot who says they're not is lying. The goal isn't fearlessness, it's function. Another nurse asked, how do you know when to push through weather or divert? Math, she answered. Patient condition, aircraft performance, risk margins. Emotion doesn't vote. But inside, she knew that wasn't the full truth. Emotion does vote. You just can't let it drive. A week later, the 19-year-old from the storm crash visited the hangar. Neck brace still in place, walking slowly. He looked at the helicopter like it was something sacred. You flew through that storm for me, he asked. She shrugged lightly. We flew. He nodded, eyes bright. I don't remember much, but my mom said you didn't hesitate. She hesitated now. Just slightly. Everyone hesitates, she said gently. What matters is what you do after. He considered that carefully. Thank you, he said. Simple. Honest. When he left, she rested her hand on the aircraft's frame. Storms would come again. Memories would surface again. Healing wasn't linear. But she was no longer afraid of the flicker. Because now she knew something she hadn't before. Being strong didn't mean never shaking. It meant steadying yourself in time to keep someone else safe. And sometimes strength isn't loud in the sky. Sometimes it's just quiet hands on the controls, choosing, again and again, to stay present. What if the hardest flight isn't the one in the storm, but the one inside your own head? The call came just after midnight. Structure fire, rural county south of Savannah, one firefighter down, severe burns, airway compromised. Firefighters are different. They run toward heat the way aviators run toward sky. Kaya was halfway through a cup of tea in her apartment when dispatch lit up her phone. She didn't hesitate. Boots, flight suit, keys. By the time she reached the hangar, Zeke was already loading advanced airway equipment. Reports say he went back in for a kid, Zeke said quietly. Of course he did. They lifted off into a night that felt heavy. No storm this time, just darkness pressing close. Flying at night is intimate. The world shrinks to instruments and faint ground lights. Everything outside the cockpit disappears. For Kaya, night still carried echoes. She kept her breathing slow. At 900 feet, Savannah fell away behind them. Ahead, an orange glow pulsed against the horizon. The fire scene was chaos, flames licking the skeleton of a farmhouse, smoke rising thick and oily. Fire crews moved like shadows in reflective tape. The injured firefighter was 26. Burns across chest and arms, inhalation injury suspected, oxygen saturation plummeting. Kaya dropped beside him, visor down. Hey, she said firmly, leaning close so he could see her eyes. Stay with me. His breathing was ragged, panic rising. I can't, he gasped. You can, she said evenly. Listen to my voice. She intubated smoothly despite wind and smoke. Zeke secured lines. They loaded fast. Back in the cockpit, she lifted carefully to avoid rotor wash feeding the flames. At 400 feet, she felt it again. Not a warning light. A memory. The flicker of orange reflected in cockpit glass. Burning metal. Burning desert. Her pulse spiked. For half a second, she smelled aviation fuel instead of smoke. Her hearing aids picked up a high-pitched whine that wasn't there. Phantom frequencies. Trauma doesn't just show up in storms. It shows up in light, in smell, in sound. She tightened her grip. This is not Syria. This is Georgia. This is now. Behind her, the firefighter's vitals dipped. Zeke's voice cut through her spiral. We're losing pressure. That snapped her fully back. She recalculated route options instantly. Direct line over marshland would shave 2 minutes. 2 minutes matters when lungs are burning. Hold on, she said, not to Zeke. To herself. She banked slightly, committing to the faster corridor. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just math. They touched down on Coastal Memorial's rooftop 6 minutes later. The trauma team was ready. As they transferred the firefighter, his gloved hand gripped her sleeve weakly. "Did we get the kid?" he rasped. She nodded. "Yes." Relief softened his face before anesthesia took him under. After shutdown, she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she sat alone in the cockpit, night wrapping around the aircraft. The high-pitched phantom sound lingered faintly. She removed one hearing aid and then replaced it. Adjusted frequency slightly. Grounded herself in real sound. Footsteps on concrete, distant siren, wind. Not war. Present. Rooster climbed up beside her quietly. "You look pale," he said. "Smelled fuel that wasn't there," she admitted. He nodded slowly. "I used to taste sand during thunderstorms after my first deployment," he said matter-of-factly. "Brain plays tricks. You ever worry it'll catch you at the wrong time?" "All the time." She looked at him. "So why keep flying?" He shrugged lightly. "Because quitting didn't stop it either." That settled deep. Avoidance hadn't healed her. Exposure had. Each flight, each storm, each flicker of memory she met head-on. Healing wasn't erasing the past. It was proving the present was stronger. The firefighters survived. Weeks later, heavily bandaged but walking, he visited the hangar with his captain. He shook Kaya's hand carefully. "They told me you flew straight through smoke and backdraft wind," he said. She shook her head faintly. "We flew." He smiled. "Either way, thank you." After they left, Zeke leaned against the fuselage. "You notice something?" he asked. "What?" "You don't flinch as long anymore." She considered that. He was right. The flashbacks were shorter. The phantom sounds faded faster. Not gone, but manageable. "You ever think about talking to someone?" Zeke asked gently. "I talked to my grandmother," she replied. He gave her a look. "You know what I mean." She did. Military pilots don't volunteer for therapy easily. There's pride tangled up in resilience. But resilience without support phrase. "I'll think about it," she said. And this time she meant it. The Nightingale Protocol was expanding beyond Coastal Memorial now. 3 regional air medical programs requested her curriculum. One invited her to present at a statewide emergency transport symposium in Atlanta. Public speaking wasn't combat, but it felt exposed in a different way. Standing in front of a ballroom full of clinicians, she felt the same flicker of vulnerability she once felt in hostile airspace. Different battlefield. Same stakes. "Combat taught me something civilian medicine doesn't always emphasize," she told the audience. "Preparation isn't just technical, it's psychological." The room grew quiet. If you've never faced system failure at altitude, you assume it won't happen. If you've never felt fear in the cockpit, you assume you won't. Both assumptions are dangerous. A doctor in the front row asked, "How do you train for psychological pressure?" She paused. "By acknowledging it exists," she answered. "By practicing worst-case scenarios. By normalizing fear so it doesn't surprise you." Afterward, several young flight nurses approached her privately. One admitted she had panic attacks after a difficult pediatric loss. Another confessed she hid migraines from her supervisor, afraid of being grounded. Kaya listened carefully. She saw herself in them. Strong, capable. Afraid of being seen as less. She realized then that the Nightingale Protocol wasn't just about advanced techniques. It was about permission. Permission to admit you're human and still worthy of the sky. That night back in Savannah, she stood once more on the rooftop helipad. City lights shimmered below. The river moved quietly in the dark. She thought about the army letter still tucked in her drawer. About Helmand. About Fort Stewart. About storms and firelight and phantom sounds. She closed her eyes. The sky wasn't silent. It never had been. It hummed with risk and memory and possibility. She opened them again. For years, she believed strength meant carrying pain without letting anyone see it. Now she understood something different. Strength meant carrying it honestly and flying anyway. Not because she was fearless, but because someone, somewhere, would need steady hands more than she needed comfort. The sky didn't demand perfection. It demanded presence. And she was finally fully present. What if the final test isn't survival, but surrender? Winter came gently to Savannah. No snow, just thinner air, sharper morning, light that felt honest. Kaya stood on the tarmac before sunrise, breath visible as the EC-145 warmed on idle. The city was still half asleep. The river moved slow and metallic under pale gold sky. 6 months had passed since Fort Stewart. 6 months of flights, storms, burn calls, pediatric transfers, long nights. 6 months of not hiding. Her hearing aids were no longer tucked discreetly beneath padded cups. They were visible, normal, unapologetic. The Nightingale Protocol had been formally reviewed and provisionally adopted by the state's Emergency Medical Transport Board. What began as a quiet training session in a hospital conference room was now being discussed at regional accreditation panels. She had chosen to stay. Not because she couldn't go back to the Army. Because she didn't need to. But life doesn't measure healing in months. It waits. The call that came that morning was routine on paper. Cardiac arrest, rural church outside town, elderly female, ROSC achieved but unstable. They lifted into a sky painted lavender and gold. Kaya felt calm. Not the brittle calm of suppression. The grounded calm of someone who had made peace with her ghosts. On scene, the patient lay surrounded by worried parishioners. White hair, soft hands. When Kaya knelt beside her, she froze. Birdie. Not her grandmother, but someone who looked close enough that for half a heartbeat, the world tilted. The woman's face carried the same lines of patience, the same mountain-set eyes. The resemblance hit her harder than any lightning flash. For a moment, she couldn't hear the medic's report. Her chest tightened. What if it had been Birdie? What if one day it would be? Mortality doesn't scare soldiers the way it scares civilians. But family, that's different. She swallowed and forced focus. Assessment, airway, IV access, stabilize. Back in the air, the woman's condition worsened. Blood pressure unstable. Arrhythmia returning. Kaya flew steady, but something inside her shifted. For years, she had measured life in missions and minutes. Now she saw something else. Time. Finite. Precious. She thought about the Army letter again. About offers. About proving she still could. And suddenly it felt irrelevant. The woman survived surgery. As Kaya walked out of the ICU hours later, she found herself dialing her grandmother. Birdie answered on the second ring. Are you flying? She asked gently. Yes, Kaya replied. A pause. You sound different. Kaya leaned against the hospital wall, eyes closing briefly. I think I've finally stopped trying to earn something, she said quietly. Earn what? Permission, redemption, forgiveness. Birdie's voice was warm. From whom? Kaya smiled faintly. Myself. Silence held for a moment. Then her grandmother said softly, "You have been home for a long time, child. You were the only one still traveling." The words landed softly but firmly. Weeks later, Coastal Air held a small ceremony in the hangar. No press. No headlines. Just staff. Rooster stood beside her, grinning. Zeke leaned casually against the fuselage, proud and quiet. A plaque was mounted near the briefing room door. The Nightingale Protocol Training Suite, dedicated to resilience, preparation, and the steady courage to act. Kaya didn't give a long speech. She simply said, "Skill matters, training matters, but what matters most is who you are when things go wrong." Applause followed. Not thunderous, but sincere. The final call of that season came just before Christmas. Multi-car pileup on an icy bridge north of town. Multiple critical. One helicopter wouldn't be enough. As crews scrambled, Kaya noticed something. One of the newer pilots, young, capable, was pale, hands trembling slightly before startup. First mass casualty in command. She recognized the look. The silent spiral. She stepped close. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded too quickly. "Good," she replied, "because you're ready." He hesitated. "What if I freeze?" She held his gaze. "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because you care." He stared at her. "Fear doesn't make you freeze," she continued softly. "Isolation does. You're not alone up there." Something in his shoulders eased. They lifted off side by side into the cold twilight. On approach to the bridge, chaos unfolded below. Flashing lights, twisted metal, steam rising from icy pavement. Kaya landed cleanly. Across the scene, she watched the younger pilot execute his own approach. A little stiff, a little cautious, but steady. He didn't freeze. He flew. Hours later, back at the hangar, exhaustion settled in heavy and deep. But beneath it was something else. Peace. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that arrives when you stop fighting yourself. That night, Kaya walked alone to the rooftop helipad one last time before the year ended. Savannah glittered below. The river moved like dark silk under moonlight. She removed her headset and simply listened. Wind. Distant traffic. Her own breath. No phantom sounds. No burning echoes. Just present. She thought about Helmand Province. About Danny Clearwater. About Fort Stewart and hydraulic lights. About salutes in hospital corridors. About storms and firelight and young pilots finding their footing. She realized something simple. The sky had never been about proving she deserved it. It had always been about service. And service doesn't end when uniforms do. It evolves. She rested her hand briefly on the helicopter's cool metal skin. Tomorrow there would be another call. Another life hanging in fragile balance. Another moment where math would matter more than ego. She didn't need applause. She didn't need redemption. She just needed steady hands. Sometimes strength isn't about surviving the fire. Sometimes it's about walking back into the light without needing to be burned again. They grounded her once. She grounded herself longer. But the sky was patient. And when she climbed back in, it didn't ask for perfection. It only asked that she show up. And she did. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't announce itself in medals or headlines. It simply acts. And when the alarms sound at 400 feet and someone is dying below, it chooses to fly.